Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Momo's Weekly Review with me, Nassim Ahmed, and my weekly guest, Mouin Rabbani. Mouin, good to see you again.
And good to see you, Nassim. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, it's been an amazing week in many ways, but also historical because the ICC issued arrest warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. So we want to be spending a lot of time examining the ICC decision. Then moving on to Israel, its occupation. There is another law that's just been passed by the Defence Minister, which will basically subject Palestine. Well, we know Palestinians are subjected to administrative detention, but he's made a decision that Jewish settlers in occupied West Bank will not be subject to the administrative detention. And we'll speak about Gaza, reports of cooperation with criminal gangs, and Israel's decision to sanction Haaretz. We've spoken about that before, but now Israel has finally done that. And then we'll discuss some of the developments in ceasefire negotiation. There's an ongoing negotiation taking place now with Lebanon. We'll get more thoughts on that, and also on revelations about ceasefire between Hamas and Israel, some shocking revelations, which I should add, we'll discuss that as well. And then we'll end with the mysterious death of an Israeli rabbi in the UAE and potential fallout from that. But let's begin, more, and as I said, with the ICC decision to issue arrest warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. Let's get your initial thoughts on that.
Well, let me start with an admission and correction. As viewers of our discussions over the months may know, I've been consistently skeptical of the International Criminal Court, and specifically have repeatedly asserted that it would find a way to keep kicking the can forward in order to avoid a decision on the prosecutor's application for arrest warrants. So I was genuinely taken by surprise that they have taken this step. It's a very welcome development, and I'm delighted to have been proven wrong. Having said that, I think the main credit here goes not so much to the ICC and its prosecutor or the pretrial chamber, but to the enormous amount of pressure that was generated on this institution by campaigners across the globe, basically insisting that the International Criminal Court do its job and fulfill the purposes for which it was established, and no longer observe a Palestine exception in terms of its work. And I think particular credit needs to go to those many members of the legal profession, essentially the ICC prosecutor and judges' peers, who I think placed them in a quite embarrassing position by repeatedly and publicly demanding that the ICC act on the Palestine file. It's a very significant development, I would say, legally, politically, and certainly morally. But it's a very open question about what impact it's going to have in the real world, because as we've seen, there has been a vociferous rejection of these arrest warrants by Israel's main allies, the United States. Germany now saying it will have to study the arrest warrant to figure out what it means. I mean, it shouldn't be that difficult to figure out what an arrest warrant means. Several others saying that they respect the ICC without necessarily specifying how they will act if either of these wanted international fugitives, Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, enter their territory, and others outrightly rejecting states rather, who are members of the Assembly of State Parties of the ICC, stating explicitly that they would not enforce these arrest warrants if either of these fugitives enter enter their territory. But I think we've crossed a Rubicon now. We've crossed yet another Rubicon. The first Rubicon was crossed in January of this year, when the International Court of Justice determined that South Africa had plausibly accused Israel of genocide. And today we crossed a second, and I would argue equally important Rubicon, where two individuals, of course, there should be many, many more, and there may yet be more, but two Israeli leaders are now international fugitives from justice. And so this entire moral veneer that has enveloped Israel over the decades since its founding is evaporating as we speak. Israel is increasingly going to be not only viewed, but also treated as a pariah, as a rogue state, as a state that has no business being part of an international system whose rules, whose norms, whose values it routinely and systematically flouts.
I mean, just how routine that's become now. Just to give an illustration of that, Oxford University will have a debate, as it usually does, on a number of things. But in this case, then one of the debates coming up is the motion is Israel an apartheid genocidal state? And that's the motion that will be debated in Oxford University. That just shows how the needle has moved in terms of global consciousness, awareness, understanding of what's happening in Gaza and what Zionism really means for the Palestinians and the international rules-based order. Let's focus a bit more, though, on the response. And we had the most vociferous reaction has been from Washington. You had Tom Cotton, who basically said that U.S. should wage war against Netherlands and occupy The Hague. Lindsey Graham, he said that the European countries who support the ICC decision should be crushed economically under Trump. And the response, one response I was kind of taken back by, it was an article in the Financial Times, and it went in far as to say that Israel will literally split the Western alliance. The ICC decision will split the Western alliance on Israel. I don't know how true that is, but the argument in the FT makes a cogent argument. And it goes on to say that, and I quote, there are talks within Republican circles of destroying the court, the ICC, perhaps by strengthening to sanction the countries that finance it, meaning Japan, Germany, France, and Britain. These are the four countries that fund the ICC primarily. If that were to happen, the way I see it, if that were to happen, I think many would see that for the sake of defending Israel and its annihilation policies, ongoing annexation, we are making the world less safe against despots and tyrants. That's what it seems the US is willing to do. Make the world less safe for everyone else from being hunted down and persecuted by the despots and tyrants just to protect and defend Israel.
Well, let's make a distinction here between the United States, which is not a member state of the International Criminal Court, and in fact has been consistently hostile to it, except when it issues arrest warrants for its enemies and adversaries like Putin and Sudan's Omar al-Bashir and so on. We need to make a distinction between the United States on the one hand and on the other hand, the United Kingdom and the member states of the European Union, which are all members of the ICC. And over the years, European diplomats have been known to say that for them, the nightmare scenario, the worst case scenario, is one in which the ICC would do exactly what it's done this week, because this would force them to choose between loyalty to Israel or their obligations under international law. And this was a dilemma they were desperately hoping to avoid. And this is I think also why so many countries, beginning with Great Britain and then including Germany and a number of others, petitioned the ICC, challenging its jurisdiction, challenging its the prosecutors' applications for arrest warrants and so on, basically beseeching the ICC not to get to this point, so they wouldn't have to make a choice and expose and expose their true positions. So what we're seeing now, I think, is a very visible conflict between the West's rules-based international order on the one hand, which, as we've discussed before, means rules for everyone else, and we and our friends can do as we please and flout international law with impunity and without consequences. That on the one hand, and international law on the other, where the same standards apply to everyone, irrespective of the color of their skin, and irrespective of where they sit on the political spectrum. We had a very clear demonstration of this, I think, in an editorial today in one of the US's leading newspapers, the Washington Post. This was not an opinion piece by a pro-Israeli columnist. This was an editorial which represents the views of the newspaper. And it was basically arguing the ICC is for lesser people. The ICC is only for our enemies and adversaries. The ICC should focus on countries like Sudan, like Myanmar, like Russia, but it should keep its hands off Israel because Israel is a friend and in so many words, is one of us and is entitled to do as it pleases with impunity and without consequences. And now you look at some of the rationales it put forward for this. One is that the Israeli leadership is democratically elected. Well, putting to the side for the moment that it is an apartheid state that has effectively disenfranchised almost half of those that live under its rule, and that even many of its citizens live as second-class citizens. Putting that to the side for the moment, being democratically elected does not give one a right to commit war crimes and crimes against humanity. I mean, the Nazi regime was democratically elected, and no one has ever suggested that because the Nazis won an election in 1932 or whatever it was, that therefore they can't be prosecuted and can only be held accountable by the German judiciary. More recently, there were elections in Kenya, there were elections in Russia, and this hasn't stopped the ICC from prosecuting cases in those two countries. The second point that is made is that Israel has an independent judiciary. Well, putting aside for the moment that is increasingly doubtful. The way the ICC works is it does not prosecute war criminals and those guilty of crimes against humanity only in countries that don't have independent judiciaries. What would be needed here would be a credible investigation by the national judiciary of the same accused individuals for broadly the same crimes for which they stand accused before the ICC. If they don't do that, the concept of complementarity becomes irrelevant, and it doesn't matter how independent your judiciary is. And here, I think it's also worth pointing out that Israel's record in terms of its judiciary with respect to crimes committed by military and political officials against Palestinians is very clear. It's basically an apparatus to legitimize and whitewash those crimes. So, none of these justifications are really relevant. Another one is a constant claim being put forward that Israel is engaged in a legitimate war of self-defense. Well, if, for the sake of argument, we accept that rationale, it still doesn't give Israel any country engaged in a legitimate war of self-defense, the right to commit war crimes, the right to commit crimes against humanity, the right to commit acts of aggression, and the right to commit genocide. So the essential argument is not that Israel is being held to a different standard. The real argument here is that international legal institutions have no right to hold Israel to the same standards applied to everyone else. And here, the one example that keeps being brought up is Syria, and Syria's leadership has not been indicted by the ICC. Well, it's for a very simple reason. Institutions can only operate in those states, in those territories where they have jurisdiction. Israel tried to prevent the ICC from having jurisdiction in the occupied Palestinian territories, but the state of Palestine successfully ratified the Rome Statute, and therefore the ICC does have jurisdiction in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and in the Gaza Strip. By the same token, the ICC cannot prosecute Israeli crimes committed in the occupied Syrian Golan Heights. So it's just kind of all this, whataboutism, exceptionalism, flat out racism, basically saying, Israel should be judged by an entirely different standard. And what this is doing, precisely as you indicated, is setting up what may well be an existential struggle between the rules-based international order on the one hand and international law and international institutions as we have known them since the end of the Second World War on the other. And Israel is the litmus test. Israel is the dividing line on this, and particularly with the Trump administration entering office in January, I think things do not bode well in this respect. And the consequences, of course, will be that any norms and values of international conduct, the laws of war, the Geneva Conventions, and so on, will be tossed off the rooftop, tossed out the window. And we will all suffer because a number of Western states have chosen to sacrifice the international system on the altar of Israeli impunity.
The article you're referring to in the Washington Post is the title is "The ICC is not the venue to hold Israel to account." I mean, if the
Yes.
ICC is not the venue, then what is? I mean, I think that they've enjoyed so much impunity. It's there's always been an argument. Volumes have been written again about this. Actually, how Israel has enjoyed this impunity and been exceptionalized. We know, for example, permanent occupation is illegal, but somehow occupation of Palestine exists in a legal vacuum. Refugees have a right of return in every scenario, but again, there's a legal vacuum there. Palestinian refugees don't have a right to return. Again, it's another exceptional scenario. Settlements are, everyone knows, illegal under international law, but here again, you have an exceptional scenario in Israel where in every clear-cut position in international law, Israel has an exceptional position, and this exceptionalism goes on to this ICC arrest warrant as well. As we need to see Israel completely in a different light than all the other cases in the world.
I don't recall Slobodan Milosevic making the argument that he was elected and is therefore entitled to wage wars of aggression, to commit genocide, to engage in war crimes and crimes against humanity. But in Israel's case, any and every spurious excuse, rationale is accepted as gospel truth.
Let's turn our attention to Gaza now. The UN has said that only 6% of the food that's required is entering Gaza. UNRWA announced that just a few days ago. But I want to talk more about the role of Israel in helping to sow discord and famine in Gaza, using terrorist groups, organizations, criminals, individuals that are said to be linked to ISIS, Daesh, and Israel is helping to do that. So we spoke about a few weeks ago where aid convoys were being robbed and stolen. They were not reaching their destination. And a lot of those convoys are being hijacked or taken by these ISIS-linked gangs. So last week, I think Hamas arrested or killed, I think, 20 members of these organized gangs last week. So in the one hand, you have Israel trying to sow discord by using these gangs and criminals, and on the other hand, you have Hamas trying to push back against that, fight against that. So give us a context as to why Israel is doing that. We spoke, I think, a few weeks back about Israel reaching out to many families and heads of tribes, and also criminal gangs to do some of its dirty work in Gaza. Most refused, some I assume accepted. So what's happening in Gaza? What's Israel's play now, given that northern Gaza is completely decimated, but there is aid trickling in, but this aid is being stolen by these criminal gangs?
Well, the context here is that Israel has vowed to eradicate Hamas not only as a military organization, but also as a governing entity. And in that context, anything and everything that represents governance in the Gaza Strip has been deliberately and systematically attacked by the Israeli military in the Gaza Strip. And we've had numerous examples over the past 13 months of Israel targeting, for example, Palestinian civilian police who are seeking to administer the distribution of aid that arrives into the Gaza Strip and similar incidents. So what we've seen here is the aid is coming in. The Palestinians are prevented from ensuring the safety and security of these aid shipments and of their orderly distribution. And then, under the very, very watchful eye of the Israeli military, these gangs, criminal gangs, a number of them reportedly linked to the Islamic State movement, ISIS, are being permitted to seize, to steal this aid, and then to sell it, either keep it for their own purposes or to sell it at hugely inflated prices in markets in the Gaza Strip. And then, of course, Israel turns around and claims that it is actually Hamas that is seizing this desperately needed humanitarian aid and operating it as a commercial venture. So, what needs to be understood here is that Israel, in addition, of course, to its broader war aim of pursuing a war of annihilation against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, also has a specific objective of eliminating governance in the Gaza Strip, and in that context has targeted any entity that is seeking to, or rather any local Palestinian entity that is seeking to ensure the orderly distribution of aid independently of Israel. The other part of the puzzle that needs to be understood is that Israel has rejected virtually every proposal that has been made for alternative governance. It rejects a role for the Palestinian Authority. It rejects other proposals that have been made. And the only one that it has really accepted is one that gives a prominent role to the United Arab Emirates. But the United Arab Emirates, for its part, has said that it will have no part of any Israeli proposal that does not also include a very clear pathway, political pathway, to a independent Palestinian state. So we are where we are, and we will remain there for the time being.
Let's turn attention to the West Bank. Of course, the war of annihilation in the Gaza Strip. At the same time, Israel is conducting or entrenching its apartheid system in the West Bank. And part of that includes employing legal tools. And one of the legal tools from last week is a decision by the Defence Minister, Israel Katz, to halt the use of detention without trial for illegal settlers. Of course, that's been going on for many, many decades and carried out against the Palestinians. Hundreds of Palestinians over the past year, I think more than 300 or so, have been detained without trial. But only 8 settlers were detained without, were put under administrative detention, put under administrative detention. But now Katz is doing away with completely administrative detention for the illegal settlers. Haaretz ran an article, an editorial, saying that it's officially apartheid. Of course, many will say that bridge has been passed long time ago. And it goes on to say that the message to the Jewish squatters in the West Bank is to do whatever you feel like, and you're beyond the law. So, I mean, the question that arises now, there's already an ongoing pogrom against Palestinians in the West Bank, and this is further going to fuel the pogroms. And now these illegal settlers have no restraint whatsoever, if there was any before, with Israel Katz removing detention without trial for settlers.
Yes, well, just to be clear, as you've pointed out, administrative detention is detention without charge or trial. And Israel's military government in the occupied territories generally issues administrative detention orders that are valid for 3 or 6 months, but they're also indefinitely renewable. And over the decades, many thousands of Palestinians have been placed under administrative detention orders, in some cases for years on end. So, under administrative detention, there is no need to charge an individual with any specific violation, nor any obligation to put them on trial. It has been used much more sparingly, but has been used on occasion also against Israelis, and for example, in the aftermath of the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in 1995, and I believe last year in a few cases as Israeli settler violence escalated to unprecedented levels. Now, what the Israeli government, as you mentioned, the Israeli defense minister has ruled is that henceforth administrative detention orders will only be used against Palestinians. It doesn't make a distinction between Palestinians and Israelis because it also will no longer be used against non-Israeli Jewish settlers illegally present in illegal settlements in the illegally occupied territories. So for those wondering, this is exactly what apartheid looks like. It couldn't be any more clear. And the reason that this gives Israel's settler auxiliaries so much more room to perpetrate their various crimes. It doesn't give them total immunity, but basically, Israeli settlers can only now be arrested on the basis of specific charges. They need to be put on trial and so on. And what we know is that this very rarely happens. And when it does happen, the settlers basically get, these are kangaroo courts, which on the one hand have a 98% plus conviction rates when it comes to Palestinians. And very, very rarely properly conduct proper trials against Israelis accused of crimes against Palestinians, let alone convict and imprison them. And so by removing this essential building block of what is already a very, how should I put it, repressive judiciary in the occupied territories, it just emphasizes once again Israel's insistence that, you know, the law works in the service of one group of people already determined by the world's highest court to be there illegally, and works against those who are there legitimately and who are illegally occupied.
I mean, related story to how the veneer of democracy in Israel not being an apartheid state is crumbling is a decision by the Israeli government to impose sanctions on Haaretz. So that's been a decision that many have been anticipating for a number of weeks. Despite what many will say, Haaretz has not whitewashed the genocide and apartheid and the ethnic cleansing in the way many other Israeli newspapers have, and it is Israel's oldest newspaper, and this will be seen as quite a big shock, not only to those who still believe Israel is some kind of democracy and encourages freedom of speech and the free press, to go after the oldest Israeli newspaper in this way. It's again, as I said, all pretense that the country is a democracy is just crumbling.
Well, subordinating the media to the leadership's political will has been kind of a central focus of the Israeli Prime Minister, the fugitive now from international justice, Benjamin Netanyahu, from the very outset. And he's in fact on trial now for his various interventions in the media. And in this case, what happened is that the Haaretz newspaper's publisher, Amos Shokin, gave a speech at a forum, I believe in Great Britain or elsewhere in Europe, where he referred to Palestinians as freedom fighters, and I believe also made a statement to the effect that Israel is no longer capable of saving itself and needs to be saved by international pressure on Israel. I mean, you know, fairly anodyne statements in any other part of the world, but the outrage that erupted within Israel was on another level. And Shokin was even denounced, I believe, in an open letter by staff of his own newspaper, not by all of them, but by a good number of them. The Israeli government has seized on this incident as a pretext to now cease all dealings with this newspaper. And most importantly, from the newspaper's point of view, is that it will halt all advertising in Haaretz. And for those who are familiar with the growing challenges that newspapers face these days, in this case, it's basically meant as a deliberate effort to seek to bankrupt this newspaper. So we'll have to see how that develops. But there's also another one that hasn't been discussed, and that is that the Israeli government is now in the process of adopting legislation that would privatize Israel's public broadcaster. And the way this bill is designed is that once it is passed, the broadcaster must be privatized within a period of 2 years, if I'm not mistaken. And if the privatization process fails, then the public broadcaster's license will be revoked. So it's these are all. There's kind of a multi-front campaign being waged by the Israeli government against its own media in order to ensure that it's subordinated to the will of the leader. It's straight out of the authoritarian playbook. But then again, so is so very much else that the Israeli leadership has been engaged in recent years.
Let's spend a few minutes on ceasefire. I mean, as we speak, we are recording this on Monday the 25th. There's ceasefire negotiation taking place between Israel over Lebanon, and there's expectation that there may be some kind of an agreement in the next few days. So maybe I get your thoughts on that. But also, there's a complicated story from the Times of Israel, based on interview with Arab diplomats, 3 unnamed Arab diplomats, and they go on to say that Netanyahu has been stalling ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas because he's waiting this period out, thinking that Trump will offer him a better deal. But the interesting point here is that apparently Netanyahu's team or his cabinet has been telling Trump that all the hostages are dead, therefore he shouldn't really prioritize hostages. But when Herzog, the president, spoke with Trump, he spoke about hostages, and he said that Israeli intelligence believe that the hostages are still alive.
Half of them.
Some of them. So there seems to be, very different communication taking place. And of course, if the fear from Netanyahu's point of view is that if Trump realizes that hostages are still alive, therefore he will prioritize the hostages above Israel's political interest, which all along has been the main driver and the main goal of this war. That's what many would say. So that's quite a shocking revelation, that this kind of level of duplicity taking place between Netanyahu and Trump, well, in the case of Netanyahu's side, and misleading of exactly what's going on in Gaza. So let's talk about those 2 issues. The duplicity and also the ceasefire discussion between Israel and Hezbollah.
Well, duplicity is very much second nature to Netanyahu. I mean, even his closest friends and allies more or less describe him as a congenital liar. So there's nothing new there. These are 2 separate issues. The first concerns ceasefire negotiations regarding Lebanon, and the other, and I think the more interesting one, is this article you referred to, which appeared in the Times of Israel, in which unnamed Arab mediators discuss their efforts to achieve a ceasefire, not in Lebanon, but in the Gaza Strip. The article doesn't make clear whether these mediators, because more than one was interviewed, are Qatari, Egyptian, or both. I suspect it may well be both. And what they make very clear is that the main obstacle, and effectively the only obstacle, to achieving a ceasefire agreement and an exchange of captives between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip is the Israeli government, and specifically Netanyahu, because Hamas has from the outset been absolutely clear that it will accept no agreement that does not first end the war and second result in the complete withdrawal of Israeli forces from the Gaza Strip. It accepted what was presented as an Israeli proposal in July, and once it accepted this, of course, Netanyahu immediately moved the goalposts. And then these mediators also point out that they haven't pinned the blame solely on Netanyahu out of deference to American sensibilities. In other words, they would get in trouble with the Biden administration if they told the truth. So they have to make statements about both sides not being ready for an agreement and so on. And this then, of course, was exploited by Washington to pin the blame exclusively on Hamas. And what these mediators say is that actually Hamas's position has been consistent and clear from the very outset, that they will not accept they will not accept any agreement that does not include these two core conditions: an end to war and an Israeli withdrawal. And therefore, it was entirely to be expected that Hamas would reject these more recent U.S. proposals for a temporary pause. And the mediators effectively ask, why would Hamas accept a temporary ceasefire during which Israel gets what it's looking for and then can resume its war against the Gaza Strip? And the final point made by the mediators is that if the Israeli government is holding out on concluding a deal because it believes that it can achieve a better deal once Trump is in office, that it's under an illusion, because Trump, neither Trump nor Biden, in their view, will be able to persuade or compel or force Hamas to renounce the two key ceasefire conditions that it has enunciated from the very outset, namely an end to the war and a total Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip.
Did you want to say anything about Lebanon? I mean, it may happen.
I think it's quite difficult to be clear on that, because here again, we have statements that a ceasefire is imminent. And what we've seen with respect to Gaza is every once in a while, the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, is trotted out to say a ceasefire is imminent, and he knows full well that it's not. And then when there isn't one, he pins the blame entirely, as is his habit, on Hamas to protect his Israeli friend and ally and proxy. With regard to Lebanon, there are reports that a ceasefire agreement may be reached on the basis of UN Security Council Resolution 1701 of 2006. And what is apparently making this possible is that Lebanon has consistently rejected any modification of this agreement out of a determination to protect its own sovereignty, but that now the United States will be giving assurances to Israel outside of the framework of this agreement that it will support Israeli violations of Lebanese sovereignty under certain conditions. So we'll have to see. I mean, I think the broader context here is that initially Israel failed to deal a fatal blow to Hezbollah. When that failed, it tried to create a domestic crisis within Lebanon between Hezbollah and its Lebanese opponents and adversaries, seeking to have Lebanese adversaries of Hezbollah do its dirty work. When that failed, a ceasefire is now on the agenda. And we'll have to see to what extent these reports turn out to be substantiated, and to what extent, here again, Israel may be holding out for the Trump presidency, which is a little complicated, because on the one hand, Israel believes it can have more freedom of maneuver, as if that's even possible, and a better deal with Trump in the White House. At the same time, Trump is reported to have informed Netanyahu that he wants his file closed before he assumes office in January.
And as you said, it's not always the case that things will go the way Israel wants, even Trump's in office. The assumptions have changed. The idea that Trump comes in and they'll simply agree to another chapter in the Abraham Accords, I don't think that's as straightforward as it's made out. And
we agree.
Yeah, we'll wait and see. But let's end with a story that's unfolding into what could be a major issue, which is the killing of a rabbi who was a soldier in the UAE. So 3 people have been arrested, suspects, and from what I read, they're all Uzbek nationals. So of course, this is an ongoing case, but it has all the ingredients to become a major geopolitical issue, especially if it turns out to be a state actor especially if it's Iran behind the killing. We don't know if it is Iran. We don't know, how this so-called rabbi was killed and who was behind it. But it could potentially become a major geopolitical storm, couldn't it?
Yes, as you mentioned, very little is publicly known about this. It was immediately presented by Israel as, and I'm quoting, an anti-Semitic act of terror, meaning that this person was killed not due to any civil or criminal dispute, not due to his being Israeli and having been a former soldier in the Israeli military's Givati brigade, but because he is Jewish. And of course, the finger was immediately pointed at Iran. Initially, we were told that this individual was abducted and killed by three Uzbek nationals who subsequently fled to Turkey and I believe from there to Iran. Now, the Emirati authorities have said that they have arrested the three suspects in his killing. So at this stage, we don't know why he was killed. It may well have been a politically motivated killing. It may have been a killing whose origins are to be found, for example, in the criminal sphere, disputes over whatever. And if it was a political killing, it's certainly possible that Iran was in some way involved, and it's at least as possible that it was a local operation for whatever reason. But as with the Amsterdam pogrom that wasn't a few weeks ago, he was still breathing his last breaths when Israel immediately came out with its own propaganda narrative, anti-Semitic act of terror commissioned by Iran, and so on. And it's a sensitive issue, of course, because Israel's best relationship in the Arab world is with the United Arab Emirates. And some commentators have noted that during the past year, that this is hardly the first attack on visiting Israelis by local Emiratis or others who live in the Emirates out of rage against Israel's genocidal campaign in the Gaza Strip, but that this is the first fatality, and therefore it's been much more difficult, obviously, to keep it under wraps. So again, we don't know. The U.S. Immediately came out with a condemnation, not dissimilar to that of Israel, as one would expect. But I think we can have theories about what happened, but it's really premature, I think, to draw any definitive conclusions.
Mhm. Yeah, as is the case with these stories, what is interesting is just how they're covered by the media and the
Yeah.
response by the various leaders. And yes, and they have really jumped the gun in this, like they did with Amsterdam and many others. But yeah, you're right. We will have to wait and see and follow the story as it unfolds over the coming days and weeks. As always, Moin, thank you for
Thank
joining
you.
us. And thank you for tuning in and listening to our weekly review with me, Nassim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. See you again next week for another episode of our weekly review show. Bye-bye.